same way you're going to do it. Okay. So you're going to type in. I'll tell you what my number is.
It gives us a lot of things to live up to, a lot of things to aspire to. So certainly we can aspire to some of the things that Dvorah said. Thank you very much for that. The story that I wrote about, and I understand that the context of tonight's gathering is the idea of a book review or a book club or a book read or something like that. The story that I wrote about, in my opinion, it's something which is very important in the general history of Jewish history for thousands and thousands of years. There are events that happen in Jewish history which are monumental, which are very important for the development of Judaism and the development of the Jewish people over the centuries. Sometimes those things are recorded in the Bible. Of course, the biblical times, the Bible has the stories in it. Sometimes they're recorded in history books. Sometimes it's recorded in tradition. And sometimes there are things of real importance, but somehow we don't view it in the right way, and we don't understand the importance of these events. So that's just my introduction, number one. Number two, the story is a very complicated story. The book is an easy read, and I write it in my introduction to the book. I write that to tell the story of the exodus and the escape of the Jews of Iran from Iran, we'll need more than one person with one book, because there are many different aspects. There are many different events, different series of events, different sequences, different stories actually that tell the story, that tell the total story. So my hope is just to get you a little bit interested. You can follow up by reading the book. I believe the book does cover the story well. Number two, you can find other books on it and speak to people who have Iranian background and learn about it that way. But my hope is that just to get a little bit of the story tonight, because there won't be enough time for us to really cover every aspect of the story, but to cover a little bit. And without boring you, I'll begin after giving those 2 points of introduction. My wife and I serve as Rabbi Rebbe in the borough of Queens, in the Sephardic Community of Queens. We've been there close to 50 years. 48 years ago, we started our rabbinic role in Queens, and most of my children were born in Queens, grew up in Queens. Devorah also grew up in Queens, and we lived in Forest Hills. We still live there in Forest Hills. Tonight, I'm not in Queens. Tonight, I'm upstate New York. And let me just mention my mother. She should live and be well. Had a stroke a year and a half ago, and the family is caring for her in a house that she has in upstate New York. We're in about 3 feet of snow up here. Temperature today was in the 40s, but it's expected to go down to 12 degrees tonight. So we're going to have a freeze-thaw cycle, which is not the best thing. But outside, there's 3 feet of snow. I'm in a house which we call the log cabin. This is when I'm up here, I have a place to stay here. And my wife and I are up here this week with our mother because our family has a cycle that we worked out, a bit of a system that the various children come up to be with my mother for various periods of time, in this way to show respect her and to care for her and so on. So I hope and pray that my mother, she's probably listening from a different building now. So I hope that she has a refuah shalem, and this is Devorah's grandmother. A refuah shalem to my mother, she should be well and live and be well and have nachas from her children and her grandchildren, and great-great-grandchildren, and God should help that we should see happiness and nachas all around, and you should have much success in your work. So that's another final introduction. My wife is also tuned in together with my mother, as I said, in a different location. So, and she was very much part of all of the events that I'm going to speak about. So in 1978, in the spring of 78, a young man by the name of Herzl Ilulian, Persian boy, grew up in Italy, came to study in yeshiva in Brooklyn, became a follower and was a disciple of Lubavitcher and Chabad. And he knew that there was a custom of sending young men out to different parts of the world during the summer, what was called Merkaz Shlichus. The outreach emissaries of the Rebbe would go out to meet with people in different communities. The purpose was always for the purpose of strengthening the observance of Torah in different parts of the world. And in that fashion, the American continent. The American continent was conquered in a sense in the 50s and the 60s. The rest of the world was conquered all the way up till through the 70s. And one of the countries that did not have a representative from Chabad at that time was Iran. We're talking about 1978. Now, the leader of Iran was the Shah, Shah Pahlavi. He had come into power. Actually, he was appointed at the end of World War II, but he hadn't really gained his power until the early 1950s. And at that point, he continued up until he was forced out of office throne at the beginning of 1979 in the revolution, the Iranian Revolution that took place at that time. The Shah was a person throughout his years of leadership, throughout the years of his reign, they were very troubled. It wasn't always nice. I remember as a young man viewing the Shah as this powerful king in the rich country of Iran, and it was something that it was from storybook style scenarios and events. But it really wasn't like that. He did have a lot of opposition. There were many different parties in Iran. It was a very lively and active political scene. Russia had influence, Turkey had influence, America had influence, England had influence, and it was quite a active political scenarios going on in Iran in those days. But in the 1970s, things were settled down, and the Jews were actually given freedom which they hadn't had under earlier rulers. In Muslim countries of different stripes and types of Muslim countries, the Jews are always considered to be second-class citizens. Sometimes they are respected and honored as being the people of the book. Sometimes they're called the Jimmy, which is means the second class, but we will accept them and allow them to follow their own religious practices and their own customs. We won't oppress them, but we will still see them as second-class citizens. So that was the way it was until the Shah. The Shah, however, realized that the Jews had a lot of potential. They were smart. When they were given the opportunity for education, they were able to help him develop his country economically, technically, technologically, and so on and so forth, scientifically. And so he gave a lot of opportunities to the Jewish people between the 50s and the 70s. In the 50s when he took more powerful reign, until the 70s when he was deposed. And the Jewish people in Iran began to be successful. They began to prosper. They began to keep up their traditions as Jews. Which, remember that, as I said, even though it in a sense, life in Iran, there was freedom to a certain degree, but they always knew that they were second-class citizens, and there was no intermingling of the different religions. The Muslims, even the modern Muslims in Iran in the 70s, still did not accept the Jews equal to them in many different things. So the Jews had to be very careful in the way they lived their lives and the way they conducted themselves. But they were smart, and they started to get involved in different areas of business and so on. There was no tradition of yeshiva life in Iran for about 100 years, starting from the middle 1800s. So in 1970s, there was no real yeshiva which students who had been studying for the rabbinate, students had been studying advanced Jewish studies. It didn't exist in Iran. I'll get to what there was there in a few minutes. So when Herzl Ilulian came to me, his uncles lived and were members of my congregation. He would come sometimes for Shabbos, so I met him. We invited him to our house to eat Shabbos lunch with us, so we became friendly. And Herzl said, Rabbi Hecht, we should go to Iran and go on this mission from the Rebbe to go to Iran and see if we can somehow strengthen and encourage the Jewish observance in Iran. I know that there are Jews of Iran. I know the Jews are faithful and traditional, but they don't have yeshivas, and they don't have real rabbis who are teaching them real halacha, and there's a lot of things that is very weak there. We could accomplish a lot of things there. I said to Herzl, why not? He had asked the Rebbe several times as a private student of yeshiva for permission to go. The Rebbe had never answered him. Finally, in the spring of 78, Rabbi Chodakov, who at that time was the senior secretary to the Rebbe, informed Herzl that the Rebbe had responded to his request, and the suggestion was that he should meet with me and discuss this possible trip to Iran and to see if we could work something out together. Now, again, I don't want to spend too much more time. This is just a way of introduction. So it worked out. We met with people in Queens. We met with Iranians in Queens. There were many Iranians in my community. I met with them. Some of them agreed even to cover the cost of the trip, and they gave us information, gave us names of people to meet with, and so on. As after all these preparations were made with the Rebbe's office, with the community members in my community, and with the contacts that we had in Iran, Herzl's brother lived in Tehran at that time. His parents lived in Italy, but his brother was living in Iran at the time. He made contact with him. The trip was planned the first week of August for us to go to Iran and to spend several weeks there. He and I were going to go in the first phase of the trip. Then I was going to return to New York. And Yossi Reichik, who was a young man at that time, probably in his mid-20s, yeshiva student, he has passed away since then. He was a person who was very active in many different areas of Jewish education. But he was to come and to spend another few weeks with Herzl after I would leave. So we were going to be there for a month or so in Iran and to see what type of research we could do, what type of ideas we would come up with, and so on. Pan American Airways, if those of you who remember the Pan American terminal at Kennedy Airport, the round terminal, Pan American flew directly to Tehran, and we're on our way. Well, we did a preparation as best as we could. We arrived in Tehran, and we met with the leadership. We contacted the chief rabbi's office, and we met. The chief rabbi was actually out of the country at that time on vacation. I believe he was in Israel. His son, who was his assistant and who was the practical leader of the Jewish community, and the Ein Jaman, which was the Jewish Federation of Tehran. We met with him, very fine person, very receptive, very interested to see if we could work together, discussed very different ideas. And he arranged that during the 2 weeks that I was there, we visited the main synagogues in Tehran, which I'll mention a little bit later, the main synagogues, and in each of which we had a crowd of 500 to 1,000 people in the synagogues that we visited on the Shabbos Friday night, Shabbos afternoon, Friday night, Shabbos afternoon. We also were able to visit all the Jewish schools that had Jewish students that went from the Otzar Torah, which was it's like a yeshiva in America, full day school with Jewish studies and secular education. Then there was the Alliance, which was a Jewish-sponsored school, but had very little Jewish courses in the course of the day. It was mostly devoted to French culture, French language, French culture, science, and history of Iran and Iranian culture. Then there was another school which also had a little bit of Jewish subjects during the week, or Hebrew. We visited the various schools. We met with the children. We met with the teachers. We met with the educators. In the course of being there, we checked out the mikveh that was in Iran. We went to the old shuls in the old ghetto area. The synagogues that we visited on the official visit, as I said, 1,000 people. These were synagogues, very modern synagogues, very beautiful. A lot of money had been put into the construction of these shuls. And as I said, as I began to explain, in the 70s, the Jewish community of Iran, many Jews in Iran had become very wealthy. They were given the opportunities. They were in import-export. They were in jewelry businesses. They were involved in the oil industry, not necessarily in the drilling, but they were involved in the business aspect of the oil industry. They were involved in finance. And so the Jewish community in Iran did have a large number of very wealthy Jews. As it turns out, many of them were wise, and they realized that they had to make sure that part of their wealth was kept in other countries outside of Iran, because you could never know what would happen with the Shah and with their protection. And that's why when the Jews did leave Iran, as opposed to Jews who left Russia or Jews who left other countries, Iraq, Jews who left Egypt, Jews who left Iraq, Jews who left Morocco, and so on, when they had to leave those countries, they couldn't take anything with them. But the Iranian Jews, as in a different situation from the others, were able to get much of their wealth out because they had understood that prior to leaving Iran, that they would have to do that. So the shuls were beautiful. But then there was the old ghetto in Tehran. going back to the days before the Shah, when the Jews were forced to live in the ghetto, poor people, and we visited several of the synagogues in the ghetto, which looked at the old shtibels, either from the Lower East Side in New York or from Israel, Mea Shearim district, and probably old European shtibels, which were in the old European cities. That's exactly what it looked like. We have some pictures of that, which when we go to the slides, I'll point them out to you. So we visited the modern Iran, the modern community. We visited the old shtibels. We visited, there was one mikveh that we visited, one mikveh. We checked the shochet in the shuk, where we were not very happy with his knowledge and shchita, and the knife that he used was subpar, wasn't up to rules, and so on and so forth, which was very, very disappointing. That was the observations that we made. We met with the educators. They admitted that there weren't enough educators there to teach the children. They agreed that if we send somebody there, they would arrange for more classes and more education. We found out that there was not even a kosher caterer in town. 100,000 Jews. You make a wedding or a bar mitzvah. You order kosher food from the butcher, who supposedly will get your kosher chicken and kosher meat. You take it to the hall. There's no kosher kitchen, so they're cooking your kosher food in non-kosher pots. The Jewish caterers did not have a kosher kitchen in any of the big halls in Tehran. And there was a Jewish hotel. The hotel that we stayed in, very beautiful 4-star hotel, had 2 or 3 beautiful festive halls. They had 2 kitchens. We finally got them to agree that if we would send this person that we were thinking about sending to Iran to be a shaliach in Iran, that they would kosher one of their kitchens and allow that to be the kosher kitchen for weddings and bar mitzvahs and bas mitzvahs and affairs and so on and so forth. So this was the situation that we found. And our intention was to see what we could do to strengthen Yiddishkeit, to strengthen Jewish observance in Iran. Tehran being the main city, where there were probably 80,000 Jews in Tehran itself, maybe even more than that. And the rest of the Jews, another 20,000, spread out into other cities. During our visit, during the stay, we saw that there were demonstrations starting in the city. Actually, demonstrations had started against the Shah. Actually, throughout his whole reign, there were demonstrations against the Shah. But in the spring of '78, some very violent demonstrations broke out against the Shah. And in the summer of '78, when we were there, we saw on television, on news reports, of violent demonstrations against the Shah. Now, suddenly, we began to realize that, wait a minute, this may not be the great idea to send somebody there. Maybe we have to change the whole purpose of our visit. And we started to speak to families. And the concept of sending their high school or college-age students to America to study in a yeshiva, a Jewish school, suddenly became very interesting, and people started to talk about this. We met with families, we met with parents, and by the time I was ready to leave at the end of my 2 weeks there, we had about 20 or 30 people who requested for us to arrange for them, for their children, mostly senior high school age and college age, mostly boys, to go to America to study in a Jewish school, study in yeshiva. Now, of course, they were also thinking about the dangers that might happen in case there was a revolution, or in case these demonstrations began to get out of hand and become violent against the Shah. In the next 2 weeks after I went back to America, the demonstrations became much more violent, and everybody realized that there was a turning point. They were reaching, the floodgates were going to break open in Iran. And so my contact with Herzl, who had remained, instead of talking about my work to find the shaliach who would go to Iran in order to work on strengthening Yiddishkeit, we suddenly were talking about finding schools in America to accept what would have been dozens, maybe hundreds of students who would want to leave Iran and get out and come to America, ostensibly to study in yeshiva, but really they were getting them out because their parents were afraid to leave them in Iran. And so the focus shifted in those 2 weeks. Now, by the time Herzl was on his way back to New York, I had gone to several yeshivas under Lubavitch, in Brooklyn, and in New York, and I met with the leadership and said, will you give us I-20s? Now, the student visas is called an I-20, which is the application for a student visa. The actual visa is I forgot what the number is 6. There's actual visa, but the application for a student visa is called an I-20, and the school issues an I-20, Then someone has to issue a support paper which says that the person would have financial support. Those are the two things that are necessary for a student in Iran to get a student visa to come to the United States. But once those paperwork was done and you did have the I-20 and the support paper, then it was the easiest way to get to America, was by student visa. And so we began to look into schools that could issue student visas. Nobody wanted to give me I-20s. The schools that I went to, all the schools that I went to in Brooklyn, nobody wanted to give me I-20s. 1, 2, 3, dozens? Absolutely not. We can't. What will you do with them? How will you take care of them? Where will you put them? We can't do it. Men, women, children, men, girls, boys, nothing. My father at that time, may he rest in peace, my father at that time was in Israel because there was a synagogue that was being dedicated, and he was very friendly with the rabbi, Rabbi Ralbach, who he knew for many, many years. There was a donor who had donated money to it, who was friendly both with my father and Rabbi Ralbach. And so my father was in Israel for this dedication of the synagogue. I got a call through to my father. I said, Dad, what do we do? What should I do? What can I do? We have now dozens of people in Iran who want to send their children, their children to America. I can't get I-20s. It happened that my father, one of the many different projects and organizations under my father's direction was a school called Hadara Torah, which was a school for Bali Tshuva, for young men who come to study Torah without the background of any elementary or high school education, Jewish education. It's what we call a Bal Tshuva yeshiva. But he also had authorization for I-20s. So my father said, I will write to the Rebbe, and I will ask the Rebbe if I should get involved, and then I will give you the I-20s. He wrote to the Rebbe, and the Rebbe's response to him was, unbelievable positive response. This is a wonderful thing for you to do. You will have success in it. You will have it. You will find all of your financial woes will be covered. Not only will we will be able to deal with this issue of the students from Iran, but the Rebbe gave him a bracha that it would also strengthen all of the other different projects that he was involved in. Well, my father got that answer from the Rebbe. He suddenly turned all he suddenly turned all the switches on. Every possible contact that he had was contacted, and he began to work. I told Herzl, okay, we have a venue, we have a way of going, we have a way to move. I'll start getting the I-20s. Send me the names. That I needed their names and some other information for each student. And so this process started. By the time he came to America, he brought me a list of 30 or 40 names of students who wanted to come to America. My father returned from Israel. We sat down to work on it. He put together the I-20s, and we gave the I-20s to Herzl. And Chol HaMoed Sukkot, 2 or 3 weeks after Herzl came back to America, he went back to Iran, back to Tehran. He went back to Tehran to start the process of having them go to the American embassy in Tehran, fill out the papers, and get their student visas. Now, during this time, again, the violent demonstrations against the Shah were getting worse and worse. In fact, Herzl himself was almost arrested once when he was in the street near one of these things. He didn't have his papers with him. It was miraculously, he somehow got out of it and he was able to get back to the hotel. But by November, this was September and October. By November, all of the arrangements were made. The students had their visas, which were issued by the American consul in the American embassy in Tehran, which, if you remember, a year later, that consul was overrun by the Iranian revolutionaries, and they were held hostage for 400 and something days until President Reagan was elected. Those of us who remember that. But at that time, in October, November of 1978, the embassy was still functioning. And so we had our first group that was going to come. Herzl made all the arrangements. The first group arrives at Kennedy Airport at the Pan Am building. My father is there to greet them. We get a bus to bring them into the city, into Brooklyn. We arranged for some of the students go to the dormitory. Some of the students we arranged in families. We hired some English ESL teachers at that time. English as a second language was the terminology that was used for many foreign students who came to America in college and in high schools. There was a course of ESL. So there were many teachers at that time who were experienced in ESL, English as a second language. So we set up an ESL program in our yeshiva, Hadara Torah. My father was able to convince the girls' yeshiva, Beis Rivka, to accept 2 or 3 girls who came with that first group. And that was the initial. Again, at that time, we thought we were bringing a few dozen students to America to study in yeshiva. We thought that the yeshiva, as it was, would be able to manage them. The students had very good hopes. Everything was calm. Their parents were happy that they got them out of Iran. Now, in November, December, the Shah realized that his regime was finished. It was kaput. By February, Khomeini had returned to Iran, had made it a full-fledged Islamic revolution against the Shah. The Shah left Iran, went to Egypt. He said he was going for a visit, but of course, in the end, he abdicated the throne, ran away, ended up in America for a while. Then he ended up in Morocco, and I don't remember where he ended up in the end, but maybe I think in Egypt was where he went, where he ultimately died. Khomeini now started the Islamic Revolution. 4 o'clock in the morning, I get a call. Hello, yes, David Shofet. Yes, Rabbi Hecht, send us I-20s. And what do you send you I-20s? I need hundreds of I-20s. Give us the names. They're kidnapping our boys in the streets and putting them into the army. We're afraid that our girls are going to be raped in this rape. Who knows what? It's you don't know what's going on here. You must get us. We have to save our children. We have to save our communities. And that's when this emergency salvation project began. My father, may he rest in peace, rolled up his sleeves and got to work. He started to hire more people for the school. We remodeled one of the buildings next to our yeshiva on East Park was remodeled. We were able to rent another yeshiva down a few blocks away for the boys' school. The girls' school, there was a room, so we were able to get the girls into the girls' schools. And from November of 78 until Pesach of 79, with the worst things going on in Iran, the Jews of Iran being terrified. At that time, they executed several Jewish leaders. Mr. El Ganyan was executed because the funny thing is in the story of Mr. El Ganyan, Habib El Ganyan, had been in New York, and he came to my synagogue to pray on Shabbat. He had a very good friend. His name was Hillel Moradi. Hillel Moradi was a wealthy Iranian Jew who was a broker. He used to travel back and forth from Iran to America. He imported drugs, he imported jewelry, but all kinds of things. Anyway, he was his friend, El Ganyan. He said, El Ganyan, don't go back to Iran. This was around Pesach time of 78. He said, don't go back. They know you. They know that you used to support Israel, and they're going to use that as an excuse against you. He said, I have to go back because I promised the Shah that I would do something for him. He had been close to the Shah, and the Shah had left Iran. He had to do something for the Shah. He said, I have to go back. He got off the plane. He was arrested. He was executed a week later because of his support for Israel. That was one. We had stayed at the hotel called the Sina Hotel. It was owned by the Beruchim family. They were the ones that agreed that they would make the kosher kitchen in their hotel. One of the members of that family, one of the prominent members of the family, arrested, executed. Now the Jews realized that they weren't playing games. Now the Jews realized that this is not just sending a few kids to America to learn in yeshiva, but we have to create a framework and a basis for the exodus of all the Jews out of Iran. So, from November of 78 until Pesach of 79, which had been in March, April of 79, we eventually brought 1,000 students through I-20 signed by my father, and the support papers. This was something that was necessary. We had to sign a support paper which says that for the 4 years that the I-20 was in effect, that the school would undertake to take care of all of the expenses, personal needs, room and board of the student. So my father had indebted himself and guaranteed the government that he was going to take care of all of the financial needs of these students. Now, that was the first phase. The first phase was from November until Pesach. For that Pesach, we took over a hall, and first of all, the daily operations, the schools, we had to set up a school, we had to create a curriculum, we had to find classrooms, we had to find teachers. At one point, we had over 200 teachers just teaching the various courses for the Iranian students that were under our jurisdiction. When we had to make all of those arrangements for them. For Pesach that year, we made a gigantic seder for most of the Iranian boys in one hall. The girls were in a different hall. In fact, the Rebbe, Lubavitcher Rebbe, the first night of Passover, it was his custom that the students who did not go home for Passover, it was the tradition in the Lubavitch schools that the senior students who didn't go home for Passover, the Rebbe would visit their Seder before they started the Seder meal. And the Rebbe, before he went home to his own house after services on the first night of Passover, he went to visit the students in his yeshiva. Then he said to his secretary, I want to go to the Persian students. So the Rebbe actually came up to the hall, was another block, another direction, where we had about 300 Persian boys in that facility. The Rebbe went up to them, he gave them his blessings, and he went into the kitchen to see the food that was being cooked for them to make sure that the food was good. The Rebbe actually took a look at the food that was being prepared. And he then went to the girls' Seder, which was in another location where we had about 100 or 200 girls in that location. The other students had been arranged to be with families during Passover. In the next half a year, now, by Passover of that year, the American embassy in Iran was completely closed down because any non-essential personnel was sent back to America because they were afraid that something was going to happen. Number one. Number two, they were overwhelmed because not only our students wanted visas, but many Iranians who had contacts with other places in America, relatives, they went to the American embassy to try to get a visa to come to America. They saw what was going on. There's a story of last year when we published the book, we also had our dinner from our organization was dedicated to the story of the Iranian students and the Iranian exodus. And we honored 3 Iranian couples who came through us, both the husband and the wife. They got married in Crown Heights as a result of studying in our schools. They set up beautiful families. One of the fellows said to me, Rabbi Hecht, you don't know. He says, I was one of the people online to get to the American embassy when it was still open. This must have been in the winter of 79, winter or spring of 79. He said, there was a long line. I waited a day until I got inside. Finally, I got inside. The fellow in front of me had a briefcase full of documents. And every document was to show how good his finances were. He had money in this country, money in that country, banks here, banks there, bank this, that. And the officer of the consul was very patiently going through all the papers. He checks off this, checks off that, checks off this. Then he takes out a form and he says, one document. Do you have this document? He said, no, this document I didn't know. He says, sorry, go home, come back tomorrow and bring the document. He was with him waited online for 8 hours. He was with the officer for an hour, and then he was sent away. So this fellow said to me, Rabbi Hecht, when I saw what happened, I said, oy vey, that's going to happen to me. He walks over to the desk. The officer says to him, who are you? Are you Jewish? He says, yes. He says, okay, in 1 hour, come back, go to that door over there, to that room. Come back in 1 hour and come back to that room. An hour later, he went there, went inside. He says, give me your papers. Stamp, 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 stamp. You got your visa. Goodbye. By that point, we had contacts with the State Department, we had contacts with the visa issuing, we had contacts through politicians and so on. There were several congressmen and senators who had gotten involved with us to try to help. And so at that point, the embassy was trying to do the best to get the visas processed for our students that were going through. From Pesach, we realized that this was not ending, but we had to continue to do the work. From Pesach, now, through the summer, that summer, the embassy in America stopped working. So we started working through Italy. And then from Rome, it didn't work, so we started working to London. In London, we had 1 week when the students arrived in London, and suddenly the embassy said, we can't issue their visas. So the London community had to find a place to put up 30, 40, 50 students that were waiting there. They arranged one of the yeshivas, one of the schools, at a dormitory. They emptied out the dormitory. They put our students in there. Finally, after 2 or 3 weeks, they got the okay to go ahead. The embassy was given okay from the State Department that they can issue the visas. This issue was a hot potato in the State Department also. Then, after November, when the embassy in Iran closed, was run over by the revolutionaries, then we moved to work through London and Austria and Italy. These were the countries. We had Herzl Ilulian went to Italy because he was from Italy, so he figured he'd be working from there. Then another person by the several other young Iranians who had been studying in America previously and had contact with various Lubavitcher communities came to volunteer to help us in the work that we were doing. There was a fellow by the name of Moshe Chayimpur. He walks into my office one day. This is in the middle of December of 78. He's Rabbi Hecht. I'm a student in New Jersey. I'm an engineering student in New Jersey, but I want to help you. I came to Adara Torah. I came to this. I know what you do. I want to help you. Okay, Moshe, what can you do? He moved into our office. He took over a couch in one of the offices, and that's it. He moved in. He didn't stop working until thousands of students had come to America. One night we needed 200 I-20s typed up overnight in order, because we had somebody going the next day. Somebody was flying to Iran to take 200 applications. I said, it's impossible. Each one has to be typed individually. You have to put in the name. It's impossible. It can't be done. Moshe Chaim said, Rabbi Hecht, give me the papers. The next morning he walked in with 200 documents typed out. For 35 years, for 40 years, I never asked Moshe Chayimpur how he did it. Finally, when I was working on my book, I said, Moshe, you got to tell me the secret. How did you get those 200 I-20s filled out in one night? He said, I had an Israeli friend who was a technological genius who had just developed a system of having a master electric typewriter control hundreds of typewriters. And he had just set it up for some business enterprise that he was getting into. He said, we were able to hook up. I put in the 200 documents into 200 typewriters. And he said, we were able to program it, this is 1978. I don't know if they did programs then. But in 1970, he said, we were able to get it so that we had the typewriters were typing in synchronization. And we were able to go over to each one and type in the individual names when it got to the place where we had to put in the individual names and the individual information. And overnight, he did the 200 documents. We sent the 200 documents to Iran the next day, and that was the I-20s for 200 more students to arrive in the next few weeks when they arrived. We had to work a system. How did we do this? My father used to go to the airport. Then there were times when suddenly the State Department told the people at Kennedy Airport to go slow, not to. Originally, we had arrangements with the people at Kennedy Airport in the Pan Am terminal, that they actually, when the Iranian kids came, they moved them quickly through the process, because they had to get the other document, the 94 document, which when you arrive, you get that document, which is the actual paper that you put into your passport. So they had to get that document when they arrived at Kennedy Airport, and they did it very quickly. One day, everything is not working. There was a monkey wrench got thrown into the system, and they're not doing it. The students are stuck inside. We're waiting outside with the bus. Somebody puts a call through to my father. My father shows up at the airport. He gets on the telephone. We don't know who he was talking to. I think he called one of his congressman contacts. And about a half hour later, okay, everything's back on track again. Everything is working again, and they're going through. There were many events like this that happened. We used to take them from the airport. My father's synagogue in East Flatbush, and I think Mr. Zedek, Murray Zedek, was once a member of my father's shul in East Flatbush in Brooklyn, New York. That building no longer had. Were you also in East Flatbush? Those whoever you were in East Flatbush, you remember the gigantic shul in East 53rd Street, which by 1978 there was only a handful of people davening there. The neighborhood had changed completely, but the building was available. So that the downstairs synagogue we converted into a welcome hall. We had tables and benches set up. When the students came, if it was 50, 60, or 100 students, you'll see pictures soon. We'll see one of these events. We served them a first meal when they arrived. And then, okay, we want to stop now and go to some of the pictures? All right, wait, let me just finish this one point. When the students arrived, the first thing we did is we took them there to my father's shul. We spoke to them. We gave them orientation. We explained to them how the system works. Then they were either sent to families who hosted them, and there were hundreds of families that hosted students for months, and some of them for a year or two even hosted these students in their homes. They made their weddings, they made their bar mitzvahs, and others we went to dormitories. And we had I'll get to the dormitory in a minute. Let's stop now. Let's go to some of the pictures, some of the slides, and I'll give you a little bit of a running explanation of what the slides are. Go ahead, Devorah. The slide, devour the pictures. What's happening? Okay, start. Okay. No, this is not the first one. That's the first one. Okay. Can you enlarge that? All right. I mentioned earlier that we visited various synagogues in Tehran. Let me just show you some of the visuals. This is the entrance to the shul, which was called the Yusian Synagogue. This synagogue had a large brick wall, 10 feet high, all around the property, and the entrance was inside of a gated area. These were the stairs going up to the second floor. On the right, you can see the entrance. The entrance into the main synagogue was here, and the stairs went up to the Ezrat Nashim, to the women's plaza. Next. This is the interior of that synagogue. You see here, this is the Heichal, which is the Aron Kodesh in the shul. Beautiful carved wooden doors. The menorah here, various psukim in this menorah, the written menorah, which has the Shir Amalot in it. Go ahead, next. This was the view from our hotel. That's the pool down here, the pool of the hotel where we were staying in Tehran. This is that same synagogue we saw before, the Yusian synagogue. This is oh, here we go. That's the shamus of the synagogue. The downstairs is where the men's section, the Aron Kodesh here, the various menorahs on the sides, and this is the bima where the Torah is read from, is right here. This was a very large, probably seated 500-600 people. This is Mr. Oh, his name slips my mind. Herzl Lulian is here. This is his uncle, Mr. Rashian. This was inside of the Menorah jewelry store. This was a jewelry store on a street called Taksha Jamshid. Was the name of the street. I remember that. It sticks in my mind. Anyway, this is a picture when there is a dedication, a plaza dedicated to the martyrs of Iran. In the background, you have the mountain range that surrounds Tehran, which I write about in the book. Here is going back to the synagogue. This is the women's section in the balcony of the Yusian synagogue. Beautiful synagogue. This synagogue was the Mashhadi synagogue, also in Tehran. This is the main men's section is here. And this is the third. This synagogue was the largest shul in Tehran. The seating for 1,500 people. That was called the Abishamian synagogue. This is the stained glass windows in the Mashhadi synagogue in Tehran. And here again, wait, that's the entrance, the gated entrance into the Yusian synagogue. And this is the Mashhadi synagogue again. This is the entrance into the Abishamian synagogue, which I said was the largest, seating capacity of 1,500 people. That was the memorial tablet. This is going back. You're showing two pictures together over here. We saw this. This is again the Yusian, again from So in 1978, there were still donkeys walking the streets of Tehran, together with Mercedes 500s and Cadillac Sevilles. If you remember 78, the Cadillac Seville was a very popular car, but the donkeys were still walking along the streets, dropping off fruits and vegetables in the local stores. Now, this is one of the synagogues in the ghetto of Tehran, one of the old Shtibel shuls in the ghetto of Tehran. Go ahead, move to the next one. I'm sorry, Radio City. Oh, yes, of course. The culture of Iran in these days was to copy America as much as possible, including having a large movie theater in Tehran, which they called Radio City. Entrance into one of the Shtibel shuls in the ghetto of Tehran. This is one of the behind the backyard of that Shtibel, where evidently there had been a building which was demolished. Just a little bit of the, okay, this is another one of the small, this is the same one, the same synagogue again, Aron Kodesh. We visited the Jewish hospital in Tehran. This is the doctor in the hospital, put on tefillin. This is again Mr. Rashian Herzl's uncle. This is the bus that the students used to get from the airport to my father's synagogue when they arrived. And This was a typical arrival scene at the shul in East Flatbush. This is Rabbi Hecht standing there. This is a typical arrival scene. This must have been 100 students that arrived at this particular day of arrival. This is Moshe Chayimpur. This is a celebration with this. This may have been at the Purim celebration, which followed that year. The Purim celebration that first year was an amazing celebration. Yes, we have the Piamenta brothers. The Piamenta brothers entertained them. And this was the Purim celebration that was held for the students. It was in my father's synagogue at that year of Purim, 1979. Moshe Chayimpur speaking to the students. This is again the Purim celebration. Now here's myself, Chayimpur. This was one of the smaller groups that arrived. This is the orientation program arrival at the synagogue before they were sent to their homes and to their dormitories. This is again, a lot of paperwork had to be done when the students arrived. Some of the girls, some of the boys arriving, students arriving. There's the paperwork. Again, one of the arrival orientation meetings of the students. Hundreds of students sometimes arrive together. Myself, my father, may rest in peace. When we are, this probably was the Purim celebration. This looks like the Purim celebration. This is at the airport. At the airport, the students go. Now, this is one of the buildings that we took over for our school, B'nai Abraham. It was a synagogue that wasn't being used anymore as a synagogue. A block away from my father's synagogue, those from East Flatbush should remember, there was the B'nai Abraham shul down on East 53rd in Tilden. And these are the students. This is one of the classrooms, one of the ESL classes, one of the ESL teachers, one of the classes that was set up for the students. Another class with one of the teachers. This was again the Purim celebration. Okay, now this was during the summer. Slow down for a second. The summer of '78, we took over a facility in upstate New York, which had once been called the Esther Manor Hotel. Over the years, it had been taken over by an organization called the Maimonides Institute for Special Needs Children. They closed the place, and the people who owned it donated it to us to use for the Persian students. We had 400 students in the summer of 1978. We had 400 students there. At the end of the summer, at the banquet, the counselors, the head counselors, the leaders were giving out prizes to the students for their studies, for their good behavior, for their participation in the various programs during the summer, which was now. This was probably the Passover of '79, after the Farbrengen, the Rebbe, was giving wine, kos shel bracha, to the people who were there. These are the students, Iranian students, who were lined up to get the Rebbe's blessing with the wine, a little bit of wine, to say the bracha after the Farbrengen. Oh, back to Machne Mordechai, which was this resort that we had. We were there for the winter too. During the winter of '79, we took up the students there for a Hanukkah celebration, and it snowed, so we had the kids skiing. This was at that Hanukkah celebration, the students, the Persian students with us in the hall. Again, there also, and davening. All right, now, there was a hospital in Crown Heights which had closed. It was called Lubavitcher General Hospital. The doctors who owned the hospital came to my father in January or February of '79. Rabbi Hecht, you got a bargain. We're going to give you the hospital for next to nothing, only a few $100,000. You got it. My father said, what? That hospital, gigantic building, there must be so many rooms. Okay, it's a deal. They sat down in a few days. They decided to work out a deal. They came up with a price. My father wrote them a check, $50,000 for the initial payment. They worked out a payment plan, and we bought the Lubavitcher General Hospital. The only problem was that we didn't send down an engineer to check it out before we bought it. When we actually visited it and checked it out, we realized that this building had been completely emptied. All the pipes had been ripped out. All the appliances had been ripped out. All the doors had been ripped off. It was one big churban. And my father was stuck with the building. It's a few weeks before Passover. We thought we would put several hundred students there in the dormitory. It was impossible. I remember how my father felt at that time. It was like one of the worst. I mean, it was one of the worst days in his life when he realized what. But He had the Rebbe's blessing. He turned around and he said, you know what? We just have to do it. They hired contractors, they hired electricians, they hired plumbers, they hired carpenters, and they put them to work. Money, we're not worrying about money now. We'll raise the money. Meanwhile, we have to get the work done. Thank God he had credit. And so they started to work on the building, and within about a month or two, we were able to start moving students into. Eventually, we did have 200 students or 300 students in the dormitory after the building was completely renovated, and it was used as a dorm. We then got another dorm on Eastern Parkway, 2 other dorms on Eastern Parkway, because during the period from Passover until December of 1979, we brought another 1,000 students. And at that time, even though many of the original group had found families in America, had transferred to other schools, had moved out of New York to move to other places, but we now had the new students, which we had to go through our school all over again, so that we kept the school running till October or November of 1980. Because during the next year, we were also involved in bringing another 1,000 students to America, even though many of them did not go to our school. We were just a conduit through us, and they were enrolled in other schools. Now, let me stop here for a second. Iranian Jewry started 2,500 years ago when the first temple was destroyed. Nebuchadnezzar destroyed the first temple 2,500 years ago, and he exiled the Jews to Bavel. Bavel, Paras, Umadai, that's Iraq, Iran, Media. And that was the area, Azerbaijan, Kurdistan, that was all the area of Bavel in those days. The Jews settled there under Nebuchadnezzar. And then we have the famous story of Cyrus the Great, who conquered Nebuchadnezzar, his son Darius, who took over after him, and then Achashverosh. It's almost Purim. Achashverosh had a queen, Esther, his wife was a Jew. She had a son whose name was Darius II or Darius III. And Darius III was the one who gave permission for the Jews to go back and to build the second temple. In fact, he even donated money for the building of the second temple. But when the Jews went back to build the second temple, the prophet Ezra Sofer tells us in Ezra, Nehemiah, and Chag Yischai Malachi, the last prophets of the Jewish people tell us that the vast majority of the exiles in Babylonia, Persia, did not go back to Israel. And so the Jewish community of what we called Bavel for 1,000 years was started with the exiles from the first temple period into Persia and Iraq, into Iran and Iraq, Media and Kurdistan and so on. So the Persian exile began 2,500 years ago with the destruction of Second Temple. Now, there are many exiles all over. Egypt was in exile. Turkey was in exile. Morocco was in exile. Spain, Jews were in exile. But Jews were thrown around from place to place. And there were very few places in the 20th century, there were very few places in the world where the Jews could actually trace their history back to the time of the first temple. There were a few places in the Middle East, including probably Yemen, because Yemen could trace itself back to the first temple. But the main Jewish community which traced itself back to the first temple was the Jewish community of Iran, because they had the history going back until the destruction of the first temple 2,500 years. And they had never left Iran, because even in the bad years, when there were bad rulers, when there were bad Persian rulers and bad Muslim rulers, they never exiled the Jews. The Jews always somehow worked something out with them. So they always had the place to be, and they never left Iran. Iraqi Jews, Iraq was part of that Babylonian exile, but during between the first war and the second war, when Iraq came under British control, the Jews all left Iraq. They moved to India, they moved to Singapore. The Jewish community in Singapore are basically Iraqi Jews. They moved to Australia, they came to America, they moved to Israel, but the Iranian Jews didn't leave. So in 1978, you had the families, the 100,000 Jews in Iran could trace their lineage directly back to the Jews that left Israel 2,500 years ago, the destruction of the Second Temple. There was probably no other place in the world with that many Jews who could trace it back. And that's why I started off by saying that when we speak about the Jews leaving Iran, it is a historical event in the history of the Jewish people, which has to go down in history as one of the major change points, one of the major transition areas in the era of Iranian Jewry was now coming to an end. And what happened was that my father, under the Rebbe's blessing and under the direction of the Rebbe, and the Rebbe was very adamant in saying that we should keep all the students together under the control of our system. Even if their parents wanted to leave Iran, send them, the Rebbe said, send them to Israel, send them to place, but the students keep here. I believe, as I explained in my book, that the Rebbe wanted in Tehran in 1978, there was a strong Jewish community, but it was very secularized. It was very assimilated. As I said, there was one mikveh, sorry to say, in the whole city of Tehran that was used on a regular basis. And when I asked the people who ran the mikveh how many people, I was very, very, very surprised to hear the low number of people who use the mikveh. As I said before, kashrus was a very big problem. It was very quite. If you had a butcher that you could trust, he would find the shochet to shech the chicken for you. Rabbi Ben Chaim, who was the head of the Otzar Torah Yeshiva, said that every week 15 people, he shech the chickens for 15 people who wanted to make sure they had really kosher, good kosher, and the shochet knew what he was doing. 15 out of 100,000. There was no commercial kosher meat in Iran. You go to the store, you find chickens with the OU on it. There was no such thing in Iran in 1978. There was no such thing as a community-based kashrus. I'm sorry that I have to say this, but that's the way it was. The Rebbe wanted the young generation that was leaving Iran. The Rebbe realized that this was going to be a whole new development. Iranian Jewry was closing shop, and they were moving. Where were they moving to? Because we were able to incorporate, set a foundation, lay the foundation for the students. The students were absorbed into America. They were able to adapt themselves to American society. They were able to get the language. They were able to start businesses. They went to college. They went to universities. They were able to get the education. The Jews who remained in Iran for another year or two until they left and ran away said, hey, wait a minute, you know what? We can all go to America. And we can start an Iranian Jewish community in America. And that's exactly what happened. The Iranian community came to America, and they built a new Iranian Jewry in America. Go to California and Los Angeles. You have certain neighborhoods which have a completely Iranian Jewish communities with gigantic shuls, beautiful communities, schools, yeshivas, day schools, and so on and so forth. You come to, in New York, we have in Forest Hills, we have a small community of Iranian Jews. You go to Great Neck, the whole Great Neck is Iranian Jews with a half a dozen multi-million-dollar synagogues and a tremendous amount of yeshiva students. My father once asked the Rebbe, you know, the students are not going to stay with us. They're going to go to other places. We don't know how much influence we can have on them as far as Torah, as far as Yiddishkeit. The Rebbe said if 10% remain observant, and if 10% get a Torah education because of the work that you're doing, it was all worth it. I'm happy to say that it's much, much more than 10%, 30, 40, 50% actually turned out to adopt a Torah life. The Persian community in America today has a basis of a Torah life. Some a little more, some a little less, some a little more observant, some a little more orthodox, some a little to the conservative side. But in my humble opinion, the reason that happened, the reason they did not become assimilated in America as many other groups of Jews who came to America, and I'm in a community, in my community, we've seen, my community is many different Sephardim from many different countries, North Africa, Middle East, Far East, and so on. And a lot of those communities have become assimilated into American culture. They don't have their own traditions. They don't have their own synagogues. They don't have their own chachamim. They don't have their own chazanim. They don't have their own nusach in their synagogues. But the Iranians stuck together. And I believe very strong that this was because of the Rebbe's directives to my father and the work that he did in keeping, building, and creating the framework within which the young generation of Iranian Jews that came to America were able to find footing. They were able to find security. They were able to find a philosophy of life which recognized Torah as being the life force of the Jewish people, with a Rebbe as a leader. This way wasn't their leader, he wasn't their Rebbe, but they could see a Jewish community which functioned with all of the Jewish communities working together, all of the synagogues, schools, mikvahs, and things all functioning with the leadership of Torah, Torah leadership. That's what gave them the image that they were able to build on in the community they went to. They moved to Great Neck, they built their own communities with that image. They moved to California, they built their own communities with that image. You know, this is my theory. I mentioned this theory. My theory is this, my book is based on this theory. And I believe that somehow we had the great schus. We had somehow some great some great fortune, good fortune, that I was a little bit involved in this, working with my father and dozens and dozens of volunteers. To start mentioning all the names in my book, I try to mention as many people as I could remember who were involved, and to express our thanks and appreciation to all of the work that they did. But the idea that we recognized that we were providing and creating a background and a framework for the Iranian community to be able to transfer itself in whole, as a whole community, with their people, with their leadership, with their organization, with their communities, and to come and to be able to resettle themselves here in the United States. I mean, again, this is just a little bit of an introduction. There's many, where are we up to? Devorah, you want to go back to some of the pictures? Let's get some more of the pictures up. I'll just look some of the different things.
Okay. I'm going to go back to some more of the pictures. I just want to know if anybody had any questions or comments or anything that they want to maybe ask you, or just say.
Yes.
Oh, okay. Julie.
Rabbi, I read the book, and as I was reading the book, I couldn't believe all of the challenges. Miracles. Everything was like a miracle. And now when you're talking about it today, you're giving us the perspective of this task that you completed. But when you were in the thick of it, with all of the challenges, and there were many challenges, you didn't mention all of them, did you think, and the people that you worked with during that time, that you were making history? Did you all see the big picture? Because it's a huge picture.
Your point is very good. The truth is we didn't see the big picture then. I can only tell you that during the winter of 78 and 79, and my wife is listening to this now, I didn't get home till 2 o'clock in the morning. I was in Brooklyn working with the students till 2 o'clock in the morning. That's an average, till 2 o'clock in the morning. And I had to be in my synagogue at 7 o'clock for Shachrit in the morning to be in my synagogue with my people in my synagogue. And it was very difficult as far as that goes. I mentioned before about the facility upstate. The people who owned that facility created, just to show you what you said about miracles, the people who owned that facility was a group of very millionaire Jews who owned the facility as a not-for-profit. They had allowed the Maimonides Institute to use it for the special needs children. Maimonides Institute left it, and they were suddenly left with a gigantic 190-acre facility 3 miles out of Monticello, which has no value to the hotel industry, because the hotel industry was already finished by 1978, and what to do with it. So they made a delegation that came to meet with my father. I remember them going into the room with my father. They said they wanted $500,000, $1 million, what they want for it. They're in the meeting with my father for an hour, for a half hour, an hour. They walk out of the room. My father says, he slaps him on the back. He says, guess what? They're donating the facility to us. I was shocked. I don't know how my father did it. I don't know how God did it. I don't know how, but that's what happened. And that's how he moved. It went from one miracle to another miracle. The doctors who sold us the Lubavitcher General Hospital were not honest people. But the truth of the matter is that the amount of money that they asked was really a joke. Of course, it wasn't worth even that amount because there were no pipes in the building. But eventually, the contractors did get the building fixed, and we did get it working. And you know something, when we meet students today, and I meet all over the place. I was in California a few years back in the summer for my grandson's wedding, and the kala was from one of the Chabad centers, in Los Angeles. This Chabad center is 90% of the members of that particular center are Persian Jews. When I went into the shul on Shabbos, everybody came over to me and said, Rabbi Hecht, we were a student, we were in that group, we were in this group, we were in that group, we were in this group. Every single 90% of the Persian people in that synagogue were students who we had brought. And they all, every single one of them said that we realize now what you did for us. We realize now that you saved our lives. We realize now that you gave us the opportunity to move here and to rebuild ourselves and to rebuild our lives. I remember some of the kids were upset. You know, kids were lonely. They didn't have their friends, their parents with them. The dorms at the beginning were not so good. The showers didn't work in the hotel, in the hospital for a few weeks, and so on. So some of the kids complained. Some of the kids complained. We hired cooks, Sephardic cooks who know how to cook rice and the Sephardi food. But for some of the kids, the rice wasn't as good as their mother's rice. So they had two or three complained to an uncle. So there was a woman in my shul, a wonderful lady. She cooks up a big pot of rice one day. She drives up to the yeshiva. She opens up the trunk of her car and she calls all the boys out. He says, "Here's rice." It was ridiculous. Everybody was laughing. But she meant it. She meant it with her whole heart. She wanted to do something. She thought she can give rice. So this gefeltkein rice, there was no rice missing in Brooklyn. We had all the rice that you could eat. And our cooks knew how to cook rice, Persian-style rice. It wasn't a problem. But these were some of the things difficulties that we had to deal with. And you're right, and there were miracles along the way. The fact that we got the ESL teachers at the beginning was that in itself was really something amazing. And as I said, it was a time when in New York City the ESL courses were being given. So there was a standard, there was books printed for it, of course, and we were able to give it to them. And the kids they did very well in science and math, better than most American kids. The Iranian kids who had the basic education, even up to 7th grade education, were on a higher standard than American children in their secular studies. But you notice from the classes, those pictures were not taken by professional photographers and the kids were not acting. In the pictures of the students sitting in the classes, they really wanted to learn and they really did learn. And we did, thank God, between the learning during the winter and the summer programs during the summer, we did, thank God, give them a good education. And we gave them a very good foundation on which to build their lives afterwards. And we're very proud of what we did. My father, I could say, devoted his life to them for the 10 years, from the time he brought them, 10, 12 years until he passed away in 1990. His main project and his main debts that his organization incurred were based with the debts that carried over for several years from the Iranian project. We also had I just add one more thing. There were many young Lubavitcher men, Bachrim, and many young Lubavitcher women that really volunteered their lives to work with the students. The counselors, the mentors, the teachers. We paid the teachers, but the Bachrim that worked along with them were volunteers. And many of them really, really devoted their lives to help these students and to help them adapt themselves into America. Any other questions?
Ta, you never cease to amaze me. I was only I think 3 years old when this thing happened, but I was telling the secretary today that I remember when we were little, we used to sing a song, Khomeini is a swine. I don't know if you remember us running around the house singing about Khomeini. So this was something we grew up in. And we had.
Well, my mother is watching this now. My mother's watching this now, and my parents actually had several girls living in their home during this time. As live-ins and with them, and going to school from my father's house. And over the first 2 years or 3 years of this project, my father did several dozen weddings for boys and girls, Iranians who met each other through this program, or had shidduchim made, got married and settled down eventually either in Brooklyn or in Los Angeles or in Great Neck. And my father had the great merit and the great fortune to be able to be the Masadic Kedushin to make those weddings. And we have so many families who may meet me and they tell me, your father was married Masadic Kedushin, your father was the one that married us, and so on.
I just want to let everybody know who's here. There's still some more food outside. There's still some more desserts. We're not judging if you take a second plate. We know how delicious the Persian food is. And if anybody on Zoom or in the room has any questions, we're going to open up now. If you want to go, you're welcome to go. If you want to stay and ask or talk, you're welcome. But Ta, it was
Murray.
Murray, you want to ask a question? Go ahead. Yeah, Ta, someone's asking if there are still Jews in Tehran.
Yes. Okay. There are probably 15,000 Jews still in Iran, and strangely, over the last 10 years, under Khamenei, who is the follower of Khomeini, who is the Islamic leader of Iran, has actually allowed that in the Jewish community, they have now a yeshiva. They have now a yeshiva, which they didn't have in 78 when there were 100,000 Jews, but now with 15,000 Jews, there is actually a yeshiva, and there are young men who are studying to be shochtim and young men who are studying to be rabbis in Iran now. So I don't know exactly how that fits into the whole picture. Again, it's only the remnants. It's only the She'eret HaPleit it's the remnants. There was a young man in my synagogue in Queens who lived in America for several years. He has a brother, lived in Great Neck. He was not married. He lived in Forest Hills. He came to pray every morning, every afternoon. He worked at a job. Suddenly he comes to me one day, this must have been 10, 15 years ago. He says, my father needs me back in Iran. I have to help him in his business. I said, what, are you crazy? You're not going back to Iran. No, I have to go back. I'll be okay. I'll be fine. And he went back to Iran. He went back to Iran. He helped his father at a store, a retail store, I believe in Isfahan, not in Tehran, in Isfahan, at a retail store. And he went to be with helped his father. He calls me from time to time from Iran. And I can't believe it. I said, you're able to call me? He says, yes, as long as Israel doesn't become an issue, they're letting us live, they're letting us practice. We have a synagogue, we have a minyan, we have a synagogue. His father has passed away since then. He's running his father's business. He says, that's it, I'm living here, that's it. So there is a Jewish life today, which is very subdued. I don't know if the big synagogues are still in operation there. I have to actually check that out. But the leaders of those big synagogues all came to America, because I met them all here after they came. And as I mentioned at the beginning, the majority of the wealthy Jews of Tehran had some way to funnel a lot of their wealth out of the country, as opposed to other countries. I mean, I deal with a community in which I have people, the Egyptians, for example, in our community, the Egyptians who live in our community in Queens, they said they gave us $20 bill when we left Egypt in 48, 55, and then 68. After the war, after 67, after 67 war, those were the 3 times. I have Jews in my community who were in concentration camps in Cairo. When they left, they had bank accounts full. Go to Paris. In Paris, the bank will give you your money. They got to Paris. Who are you? We don't know what you're talking about. There's no branch in Cairo of this bank. They had a $20 bill they gave them when they left Cairo and the shirts on their back. And similar for Iraq, when the Jews ran away from Iraq, similarly for Yemen, similarly for other places in the world too. But the Iranians, thank God, miraculously, it was a little different, the story. So thank God for that. And they've been able to set themselves up and rebuild themselves here. And I believe that we were very important. We were a very important part of that story. And not so much we, but Hashem made that the closing of the Iranian community in Iran, in Persia, and the opening of the Persian Jewish community in America, and also in Milan. There's a big community in Milan. There's a big community in London, Eretz Yisrael. When I lived in Israel in Kiryat Malachi 50 some odd years ago, when my wife and I were married, we were in a kollel in Kiryat Malachi. There was a beautiful Persian community there in Kiryat Malachi. That was my first contact with Persian Jews. And so they're all over. Baruch Hashem, there are many different places in the world, but I believe that still the concentration and the coalescence of the Persian community in America was as a result of the work that we did. Any other questions? Yes.
Am I on?
Sorry.
All right. Yeah, I just wanted to commend you for a great presentation, something that I had no idea about. So it really brought it to the fore with, a lot of energy. I also want to remind you that I wasn't really a member of the East Flatbush synagogue. I was a captive because your father was teaching me my bar mitzvah and bar mitzvahed me there when he was a young man. So my grandfather was a member, but I was a captive. And that's one of the miracles of my life, is that I met him, remember him so well. I can recognize his voice out of a crowd of 100. And when I came to Florida, I think I called you to find out what happened to J.J. Hecht. And you said your daughter was opening up a Chabad, and they came to see me. It was Purim, and they came, Rabbi Kaplan and her came to see me. I was just a few blocks away. It's kind of a miracle, It was a connection that lasted. And I actually corresponded with him once or twice and spoke to him on the phone.
I just got an email from Sidney Yachter. Do you remember Sidney Yachter from East Flatbush? He lives in Miami. He lives in Miami now. He just sent me an email. We just sent me emails back and forth.
It's amazing, but it was a very strong connection. He was an amazing man. It doesn't surprise me that he did these things, because when he raised his voice or made a contact with somebody, it was a permanent contact. He had that ability that very few people have, to create something and to change things in the right direction.
And the Rebbe knew who he was giving this mission to do.
For sure, absolutely, for sure.
He knew what he was doing. He knew that, and the fact that he was able to organize so many different sources and forces to get the job done, from the political forces to the financial forces to everything else that was necessary, to the food and the paper goods and all the things that were needed.
Yeah.
This is the thing that the Rebbe had a good lieutenant or a general, I should say, not a lieutenant, but a general that was running this operation.
That was the kind of person he was. I never forget him. Many years later, I told Devorah, I was listening on the radio when he was giving a talk in Miami, and I recognized his voice. I hadn't seen him or talked to him in 30 years. Right. And I called him, and he said he remembered me because the name Tzedek, maybe he remembered it. Yes. But since then he wrote to me after that. But to turn on the radio and hear a man say, "My, that's my rabbi." So many years later. Very powerful man, very powerful speaker. Great family.
Yeah, Baruch Hashem. We're very, very happy and proud that we can be part of it. Thank you.
Thank you for the
presentation. Let's finish the rest of the photos.
I'll get some more photos. Which ones do you want me to show?
But the next, after that sequence that we saw, I'll just see where, I'm not sure what we see there.
So I finished at the end of the sequence. I didn't put in any of the gala dinners or anything like that.
No, I don't need the dinners. The dinners are not necessary. So we went through all of the pictures?
Everything. We went through Iran. We went through the shuls. We went through off the bus. We went through them coming into the...
Oh, you're right. We did all of those. Right. Okay, very good.
Yeah, we did everything.
Okay, great. Very good. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so very, very, very much. Everybody, I want to thank you for joining us tonight. It was an absolutely, I know for me, always wonderful to see everybody and to give you some real quality. If you haven't read the book yet, go out and buy it. It's an amazing, like my father says, this is Jewish history, modern Jewish history that's important for us to know and traces us. This is our story of Purim. This is it. This is the story that's going to happen next week. It happened in that town, in that place, and these Jews are directly connected to there as we are. So I'm also going to take all the names of everybody who was here tonight, and we're going to make a raffle of everybody who was on Zoom and everybody who was at the event. And we're going to raffle. I'm going to take a drawing, and we're going to do two signed copies of the book. We'll go to the raffle winner. We'll notify you by email if you were the winner. Rabbi Hecht, thank you.
Okay, Devorah, thank you very much. Wonderful. Listen, I just want to say we're very proud of what Devorah and Rabbi Kaplan are doing. I mean, our family is very proud, and Lubavitcher is very proud. And certainly this is the legacy of the Rebbe, and this is the legacy of her grandfather, Rabbi Jacob J. Hecht. And I'm so happy to see such you wonderful people, that your connection and your enthusiasm, and I'm sure that you're all involved in support of the. We've been to Florida several times. I've had the wonderful fortune of being able to daven in your shul several times. We've been there for simchas, for bar mitzvahs, for bas mitzvah, and so on. So. And we were supposed, and the truth is, my wife and I were really supposed to come this week because my wife is off from school. She's a teacher; she's still teaching, and she's off from school. But as it worked out, the rotation worked out that my wife and I have to be with my mother this week. So we gave up our being in Florida in order to be here with my mother. And my wife is, for her it's a big sacrifice, but she really wanted to go to Florida to be with the Vorla. But anyway, Mitzvah Hashem will try to make it up at a different time and to visit with you and to be with you. By the way, the book is an easy read. It's like a quick. It's a story. You can read it. Read it in one setting. It's an easy read, and the pictures are in the book also. Also, we have an index, and it's very interesting. It's not expensive. It's soft cover. We published it in soft cover now. Amazon's publishing it in soft cover.
Ta,
Yes.
I want to introduce you to the oldest Farsi, like we say in our sit down, sit and say hello.
I'm zooming it.
Assalamu alaikum. Nice to meet you.
I came here 1952.
Oh boy.
So I missed all that. I'm glad I heard you because beautiful. You did a beautiful job.
Thank you.
You did a great job. It's
Thank you.
phenomenal. I know that all my brothers and sisters, they all live in LA.
Right.
And so, of course, like you're right, they're all millionaires and very rich. We live in Florida. I live in Hollywood, Florida. And Mashhadi was very interesting to talk about. Mashhad was converted to, the ruler said, either you're going to become Muslim or you get out of here.
In 1843.
They
In
all
1843.
converted to the Muslim religion.
Right.
And my uncle lived in Iraq. And like you said, they said to him, get out of here, leave everything behind. He was multimillionaire. He left everything behind and went to Israel. Whatever you were saying was very, very fascinating.
Okay, thank you. God bless you. Atzlacha. Lots of good luck in everything that you do. Inshallah, God should give you good things.
His great-grandchildren are in my preschool.
Wow. Okay. Lots of nachat. Lots of mazel. Lots of bracha to everyone. Mazel bracha to everybody. God bless you all. Devorah, I'm leaving. Devorah, I'm leaving. Okay. Should I?
Good night. Thank you so
Good night.
much.
All the best to you.
Okay.